Beneath our cities and oceans, under ice sheets and desert winds, the past is quietly slipping away. Streets once alive with laughter now crumble unseen. Diaries rest unopened. Seeds sleep in Arctic vaults. Bridges rise halfway and stop as if the dream simply broke. Even when disaster strikes, a mountain explodes, a ship vanishes, a town drowns, the event itself can fade until only rumor remains. Yet fragments resist. A camera thawed from snow. A bottle washing ashore after a lifetime at sea, a single page of ink saved from ruin. This journey asks a haunting question. If no one remembers, did it truly happen? Join us as we follow forgotten traces across ice, sky, and sand, chasing the fragile thread of witness that keeps our world from quietly erasing itself. In the south of Buenos Aires province, there is a wide stretch of land where the light feels different, pale and almost silver against the flat horizon. Here once stood Villa Picuan, a small lakeside town built in the 1920s with narrow streets, lined by poplars and brick houses painted in cheerful colors that tried to echo the optimism of the new century. Families came from as far as Buenos Aires City to bathe in the salt lake, whose waters were said to heal aching joints and skin. They rented rooms above butcher shops, ate roasted lamb and homemade pasta, and listened to radio's whispering tango songs while the summer wind rattled the shutters. By the late 1970s, the town held more than 1,000 permanent residents and could swell to 5,000 in high season. There were hotels with names like El Centro and Crystal, a busy railway stop, and a plaza where children raced their bicycles in wide loops under plane trees. In November 1985, the calm broke. Heavy rains and mismanaged water control systems caused Lago Apecuan to rise without pause. Eating first at the lakeshore pastures, then at the low farmland, and finally at the outer streets of the town. People believed the water would stop, as it had in earlier seasons. They moved furniture to higher floors and waited. But each day it came higher, and soon police with megaphones urged evacuation. By Christmas, most of Villa Ipecuan was under a shallow silver sheet that reflected the roofs of houses like a cruel mirror. Entire lives were packed into trucks and carts, radios, wedding dresses, ledgers, birth certificates, while cows stood belly-deep in brine and dogs swam after departing boats. The water kept coming until it reached 10 meters above the old street level, swallowing the town completely and turning it into an underwater ghost visible only to memory. For nearly 25 years, Villa Ipecuan lay drowned. Tourists drove to the edge of the new lake and saw only waves with no sign of the hotel balconies or the butcher shop or the small cinema that once flickered with Argentine newsreels. Children who had left as toddlers grew up elsewhere and barely knew the place. Existed except in family stories told with an ache that never quite left the voice. Maps changed. The town was erased or marked with a faint blue smear. Roads ended abruptly where the water had cut across. Some locals refused to return. Some said it was better forgotten, a wound too deep to reopen. Then, slowly, the lake receded. Years of drought and shifting weather patterns caused the water to pull back, exposing first the highest rooftops, then the outlines of entire blocks. By 2009, you could walk along cracked white streets coated with salt, as if the earth itself had frosted over. Lamp posts stood at odd angles, their wires long gone. Window frames gaped without glass, and signs that once advertised bakeries or small grocers clung to walls like faded tattoos. The air smelled sharp and mineral, and in the wind you could hear roof tiles rattling loose. One man returned and stayed, Pablo Novak, who had been a young shop owner before the flood. By then, he was in his 70s and built a simple home from scraps amid the ruins. Journalists found him living alone with his dogs, welcoming curious travelers who came to photograph the drowned, city reborn to silence. Walking there today feels like stepping into someone else's half-forgotten dream. You pass a rusting bed frame tilted in a doorway. Piles of tiles where a kitchen once stood, the cracked basin of the municipal swimming pool. Graffiti marks some walls, names and dates, small memorials left by descendants of those who fled. The salt has eaten away paint and mortar, making every surface brittle and pale. Yet there is beauty in it too. Sunsets burn orange across the endless flat water beyond the ruins. And at night stars fill the sky because there are no streetlights left to compete. Visitors speak in hushed tones as if not to disturb what remains. The story of Villa. Epicuan lingers because it shows how forgetting can happen without cruelty, only with time and water. Lives that were vivid in the 1970s, merchants balancing ledgers, children playing marbles outside the school built in 1938, simply drifted apart once the town was gone. Memory depends on place. When the place is lost, the details scatter like feathers in the wind. But memory also has its own stubborn tides. Decades later, people return to stand where their homes once were, touching the ruined walls with hands that remembered how doors once swung open and radios once played Gardel. Some wept quietly. Some smiled at the absurd persistence of a town that refused total erasure. Epicuan is no longer thriving. But it is no longer drowned either. It is a caution whispered in stone and salt. Reminder that maps are fragile and that forgetting can arrive with a flood as easily as with silence. Yet each photograph taken now, each visitor who listens to Pablo Novak's quiet recollections, pushes a little against that forgetting. Even if names fade and dates blur, there remains a record in the wind across the plain. Something happened here, and someone remembers. High in the Bernese Alps, where the air thins and the sun turns snow into blinding white light, there are places once thought permanent, where ice stretched in quiet authority across valleys and sealed away entire worlds. In these places, the line between present and past is drawn not by fences or signs, but by the slow and patient breath of a glacier. Each summer now, as the seasons grow warmer and the great rivers of ice shrink back, things long hidden come into view. It happens so slowly you could almost miss it, a dark shape at the edge of melting snow. A scrap of canvas stirring in the wind, the hilt of a rusted ice axe emerging where no one has stepped for decades. Yet for those who climb or work along the retreating tongues of glaciers, these moments feel like doors opening to forgotten rooms. One summer, in 2012, near the Swiss resort of Zermatt, two climbers discovered human remains on the surface of the melting Thawed glacier. Later, they would learn the bones belonged to climbers lost in the 1920s. Swallowed whole by a blizzard and never seen again, their families left only with the ache of unanswered questions. Their boots were still laced, their wool coats matted with ice, and among the scattered belongings lay a pocket watch stopped long ago. Farther east, on the Morteratsch Glacier, search teams have found mountaineering ropes stiff as wood, pittons hammered into stones no one had touched in half a century, and small diaries with pencil marks still legible if you hold them to the light just right. The ink may have faded, but there are names and dates. June 3rd, 1934. Hans and Greta, the word fog underlined twice, a small, stubborn record of two lives in a single day that would have disappeared had the glacier not moved aside. The phenomenon is not limited to the Alps. In Greenland, as the ice sheet shrinks and Milans roar with rushing meltwater, traces of long-ago expeditions emerge. In 2016, researchers near Camp Century, an abandoned Cold War base buried beneath snow since 1966, found forgotten tunnels and equipment preserved like artifacts in a frozen museum. Not far away, Inuit hunters have reported seeing strange wood and iron objects surfacing near ancient hunting grounds. Pieces of European ships that once tried to map the Northwest Passage and failed, leaving no word behind. Sometimes the findings are humble. A reindeer hide mitten, a rusted stove, a tin of biscuits whose paper label still clings faintly, but each one interrupts the long silence of the ice. Perhaps most haunting are the soldiers who reappear. During the fierce battles of the Italian front in the First World War, thousands of men fought and died on glaciers like the Presina and Adamello, entire trenches carved into ice and snow. When war ended and the front went quiet, the mountains simply closed over them. For nearly a century, the White War, as it was called, lay entombed. But with each hot summer, the ice steps back and delivers its witnesses. In recent years, Italian teams have recovered wooden bunk beds, rifles, diaries, even plates of half-finished meals left when avalanches swept through. The soldiers' bodies come back as well, astonishingly preserved. Skin and leather, hardened but intact, faces still turned toward the sky. They are carried down to chapels and military cemeteries with belated honors. Their names added to rolls once marked only as missing. To stand at the edge of one of these glaciers and look at what it gives back is unsettling in a quiet. You are watching time unseal itself, yet there is no rush or drama, only a steady dripping and the occasional crack of ice. Guides who know these mountains speak softly about the discoveries, aware of the families who once waited in vain. Some artifacts go to museums in Chur or Bolzano. Some are buried again with ceremony. Locals sometimes keep small things a button, a brass compass not out of greed but because it feels wrong to throw away what someone once carried in hope of returning home. There is also an odd tenderness in how nature returns. The glacier does not spit them out angrily. It lays them down, piece by piece, as though handing back what it can no longer keep. A boot one summer, a glove the next, the leather still pliable enough to imagine the hand that wore it. In this slow exhale there is a reminder that forgetting is never complete. The world remembers, even if we do not. The ice is a library written in cold and silence. And when the climate changes, it begins to read its pages aloud, but there is unease too, because these returns are also warnings. Each body found, each relic of a vanished expedition, arrives because the glaciers are shrinking faster than anyone expected. Scientists at the University of Zurich measured the loss each year, meters of thickness disappearing, entire tongues of ice gone within a single generation. What is revealed may fill us with wonder, but it also marks the passing of something once vast and eternal. When we see a mountaineer's rope emerge after a century, we are not only remembering him, we are watching the boundary between past and present move in ways that will change landscapes forever. Still, there is a kind of grace in these small resurrections. Families finally have graves to visit. Diaries once sealed in blue ice speak again. Even objects without owners, a battered camera, a ski pole, remind us that no step into the unknown is fully lost. The glacier keeps its own careful record, and when the time comes, returns what was entrusted to it. Long after names fade from memory, long after maps change and towns vanish, something remains waiting in the cold, ready to tell us that yes, someone passed here. And their story did happen. In the telling of history, there is always a quiet moment when the thread breaks. Not because no one wanted to remember, but because the record itself was lost. And nowhere is that felt more sharply than in the story of libraries that have burned. The Royal Library of Alexandria has become a kind of legend, a symbol of what can vanish when knowledge lives in fragile form. Founded under the reign of Ptolemy II, around the 3rd century before Christ, it was said to contain hundreds of thousands of scrolls gathered from ships entering the busy harbor, works by Euclid and Archimedes, plays by Sophocles and Aeschylus, whole collections of philosophy from Greece, Egypt, India, and beyond. The exact number will never be known because the catalog itself, the Pinax compiled by Callimachus, did not survive. What we have are scattered references from writers centuries later, each describing the wealth of thought stored there and each uncertain about how and when the Great Fire came. Some say Julius Caesar's siege of Alexandria in 48 BCE sent flames across the docks into warehouses full of papyrus. Others blame Emperor Aurelian's campaign in the 3rd century. Still others the decree of Theophilus or the later conquest under Caliph Omar. No single date is certain, and perhaps that uncertainty is part of the wound. We cannot even mark the day the knowledge died. What is clear is that at some point the scrolls were ash. The scholars who once walked those colonnades were gone, and a piece of the ancient world's memory closed itself forever. It is not that humanity forgot mathematics or medicine entirely, but what might have been known. The missing proofs and lost treatises will never be rebuilt word for word. When people say the library burned, they mean more than wood and parchment. They mean an entire shape of possible thought burned with it. That lesson should have been enough to protect what followed, but it has not been. Fire remains patient, and libraries remain vulnerable. On the night of August 25, 1992, during the siege of Sarajevo, artillery shells struck the Vječnica, the city's national and university library, a grand Austro-Hungarian building with stained glass and arched windows. Inside were more than 2 million books and documents, including centuries of Bosnian history, Ottoman land registers, manuscripts in Arabic, Persian, and Latin, and rare newspapers chronicling daily life across generations. As the building burned, staff and volunteers formed human chains to carry out what they could, but the heat was too fierce, the shells kept coming, and the water supply had been cut. People remember pages floating down the Miljaska River like black snow, charred edges still glowing, the city's memory drifting away by the current. The next morning, the shell of the library stood like a mouth of broken teeth, and an entire cultural inheritance was reduced to smoke. It happened again, far from the Balkans, in South America, where the National Museum of Brazil in Rio de Janeiro caught fire on the night of September 2, 2018. The building, once the residence of Portuguese royals, housed over 20 million artifacts, dinosaur fossils, ancient Egyptian mummies, the oldest human skeleton found in the Americas, known as Lusia woman, priceless indigenous recordings and linguistic archives from tribes that no longer have living speakers. Firefighters struggled because nearby hydrants were dry. The blaze raged for hours unchecked. By dawn, the museum's roof had collapsed, and collections gathered over 2 centuries were gone. Scientists wept openly in front of the cameras. Some tried to salvage hard drives and fragments, but most of the knowledge, unique and irreplaceable, became smoke that night. A child of Rio said later she had visited on a school trip the year before, had stood in front of Lusia's skull without knowing it. It would be the last time anyone could see her whole. These losses are not simply accidents. They expose how much collective memory still depends on fragile things: paper, film, even digital servers that can fail when power dies or wars begin. We speak about data as though it floats safely in clouds, yet those clouds live on machines that can burn or be bombed or quietly corrode. Each time a library falls, we feel again the truth that civilization builds its continuity on tinder, and yet there is something deeply human in the aftermath, a stubborn resistance to full forgetting. In Sarajevo, people gathered fragments of books from the river and pressed them between boards to dry, even if only single pages remained. In Brazil, researchers around the world offered scans and photographs of items once displayed, a digital echo rising to fill some of the silence. And in Alexandria itself, modern Egypt built the Bibliotheca Alexandrina near the old harbor in 2002, a vast sunlit building faced with carved letters from every known alphabet, an attempt to say that memory, while fragile, can be rebuilt and guarded again. Still, the truth lingers, and it is both sobering and strangely beautiful, that centuries of thought can vanish in an evening, that all the work of scribes and scholars can become smoke drifting out to sea or up into the night sky. The act of remembering becomes urgent when we know how icily it ends. If you walk through a library now, anywhere, a quiet university hall in Buenos Aires, a public branch in Manila, a mountain archive in Norway, you might hear that whisper under the hush of pages turning, that these walls are temporary, that the words you hold can be gone before morning. And perhaps that is why we keep rebuilding, why survivors of every fire gather what remains and begin again. Because even when forgetting wins, there is always someone ready to light a new lamp against the dark and fill the shelves once more, far out on the North Atlantic, where the horizon bends in every direction and the sea seems to erase its own footprints each morning. There are vessels still moving that no one is steering. They go where the current chooses, their decks swept clean by wind and salt, their cabins filled with the sound of water echoing through empty passageways. Sometimes they still speak, a faint electronic heartbeat, a distress beacon, an automatic identification signal. A weathered radar ping makes its way across the static to receivers on distant shores. And for a moment, someone knows the ship is alive, even if no human hand has touched its wheel for years. One such story began with the MV Ljubav, or Lova, a white passenger ship built in 1976 in the former Yugoslavia, Once used to carry tourists along the icy beauty of the Russian Far East and the Canadian Arctic, she was named for a Soviet actress and for decades moved steadily from port to port. But by 2010 she had fallen into neglect. Sold at auction for scrap and tied up in St. John's, Newfoundland. In late January 2013, after years of legal disputes and unpaid bills, our tugboat finally towed her out to sea to begin the long trip to a scrapyard in the Dominican Republic. But within a day, heavy winter weather snapped the tow line. The tug crew judged the attempt too dangerous to repeat and turned back to port. The Orlova, empty and unpowered, vanished into fog and blowing snow, leaving only a signal on maritime tracking screens. For weeks that winter, she drifted somewhere east of Canada. Satellites caught glimpses, a blip here, a distress alert there, but ice storms. And vast distance kept anyone from reaching her. Some believed she would soon sink. Others imagined her heading toward Ireland or the Azores, carried by the Labrador Current into the wider Atlantic. Newspapers ran anxious, almost playful headlines about a ghost ship full of cannibal rats. Though there was no proof of rats at all, only the eerie knowledge of a hull moving alone across black water. In March of that year, an automated emergency beacon on board activated, possibly when waves broke open parts of the deck, but no confirmed wreckage was ever found. The ocean simply folded her into its miles of silence. The Lyubov Orlova is far from the only one. Ghost ships have wandered sea lanes for centuries. Though their language has changed from tattered sails to faint digital voices, in 2006, the tanker Jianseng was spotted adrift off Queensland, Australia. No crew. No identifying paperwork, only rice and food scattered in the galley. Its engines dead, but hull intact. It was presumed abandoned by smugglers who could not afford repairs, yet its exact origin remains uncertain. In 2015, a small Taiwanese fishing boat, the Taiching 21, was found near Kiribati, with nets still out and no one aboard, its last log entries days old. Fire damage hinted at trouble, but the truth sank with its missing men. The list goes back decades: the Bellamica off Sardinia, the High Aim 6 near Christmas Island. Each story a question mark trailing on ocean charts. There is something about these ships that unsettles even seasoned sailors. Perhaps because the ocean is already a place of thin margins and long memory. A freighter built with steel plates, diesel engines, and satellite gear seems permanent when tied at a wharf. But let one storm sever its tether, and it becomes as helpless as driftwood. Yet it does not die quickly. It moves for months or years, powered by current and wind, sending signals when its batteries hold, until at last a storm rolls it under, or it strikes a hidden reef. The sea gives nothing back easily, so the wreck may sink in thousands of meters of water or run aground on a remote atoll. Discovered years later by fishermen or scientists, sometimes, long after abandonment, these hulls turn into strange laboratories. Oceanographers tracking debris from the 2011 Japanese tsunami have logged ghost vessels among the waves of drifting objects, watching how barnacles, crabs, and entire microecosystems colonize the steel and wood. Marine salvage experts study their paths to refine models of current and wind. Even the faint pings of automated beacons feed into datasets about how storms move and how the sea reclaims what humans build. A forgotten ship is at once a hazard to navigation and a gift of information. Though no one who lost it meant for it to teach, standing on a cold pier and thinking of the Orlova or the Jianseng, you can feel how fragile ownership becomes once a vessel passes beyond sight. Papers, registries, and laws fade out there. Insurance lapses, companies dissolve, and yet the thing itself keeps going. Full of human touch, welders, seams, painted names, galley cups, prayer flags, and a wheelhouse window, all drifting without witness. It is easy to imagine that nothing matters if no one remembers, but the sea disagrees. It holds the engineering, the effort, and the accidents long after our signatures have washed away. For some, these ghost signals are haunting. For others, they are a kind of poetry. In Newfoundland, old mariners say the Orlova probably lies somewhere deep and quiet, its Soviet brass fittings dulled but intact. A ship that refused to come home, but also refused to declare itself lost. In Australia, the unnamed owner of the Jianseng is still officially unknown, and the ship's end was a scuttling at sea after the Coast Guard towed it away to avoid danger to other vessels, a controlled erasure. Though not before its story made papers around the world, each case reminds us that disappearance is not a single event, but a process, slow and restless, carried by wind and tide. The ocean is wide enough to forget, but it does not forget completely. It keeps these hulks moving until someone glimpses them on a screen or through binoculars and remembers to ask what happened. The signals are weak, sometimes only a fraction above noise. Yet they mean that something built by hands and minds still endures out there beyond the shipping lanes. It is a faint answer to the question of whether a thing matters once it's unclaimed. The ship, silent and alone, says it still exists, at least until the sea decides otherwise, far above the thin veil of air that wraps our world. There is a place so silent it seems outside of time, a place where shadows hold their shape for centuries because no wind comes to move them, and there, scattered across gray plains of powder, lie the objects we left behind when we first stepped beyond Earth. Between 1969 and 1972, during the Apollo missions, astronauts brought with them cameras, tools, flags, seismic sensors, even the boots from their suits. And when they left, they did not bring everything home. The lunar module could only carry so much weight back through space and atmosphere, so each crew had to lighten their load before heading for Earth. Some things were tossed aside simply to make room for rocks and core samples. Other things were meant to stay as quiet instruments, recording moonquakes or solar wind. And some were abandoned with a practical shrug because no one would return soon enough to need them again. If you could walk today where Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on July 20th, 1969, you would still see the Hasselblad camera they left near the Eagle landing site, the one used to take the photographs that defined that first landing. Its silver body would be dulled, but intact, untouched for more than half a century. Beside it would be scoops and tongs once used to collect lunar dust, now resting in that same dust, and nearby the lower half of the lunar module, still planted like a marker of human arrival. The footprints themselves are still there too, crisp and strange because the moon has no air, no rain, no rushing rivers to wash them away. The only change is from micrometeorites that, over millions of years, may slowly blur the edges. For now, the prints of 1969 look almost as new as the day they were pressed. Other landing sites hold their own frozen stories. Apollo 12's crew, Pete Conrad and Alan Bean, left behind parts of the Surveyor 3 spacecraft, which they visited and sampled after it had sat for nearly 3 years on the surface. Apollo 14 left a small cart used to haul heavy equipment, kind of lunar wheelbarrow abandoned when Alan Shepard and Edgar Mitchell climbed back up the ladder. Apollo 15 through 17, the later missions, left entire rovers, electric buggies once driven across dusty valleys with quiet excitement, now sitting with their seats empty and tires untouched except by light itself. These are not ruins like those on Earth, softened by moss or ivy. They are perfectly preserved, sharp-edged against the gray. Even the plastic wrappers for meals, the experiment packages, and handwritten checklists tossed from the cabin remain where they fell. It is easy to forget that these things are still out there because the moon feels finished in our minds. We think of the footage, the grainy television broadcast. It's the words "one small step," and we imagine the story closed when the astronauts splashed down in the Pacific. But the story did not end. It just went quiet. In 2012, researchers using images from NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter managed to photograph many of these landing sites from orbit. They saw the trails where astronauts walked, the gear shining faintly in the stark light, the descent stages of the lunar modules casting long shadows. Those pictures reminded the world that our first exploration did not fade with memory. It is still physically there. Waiting the distance, though, changes how we hold it in mind. The moon is close in cosmic terms, only 384,400 kilometers away. But for most of us, it might as well be unreachable. No one has visited since December 14, 1972, when Gene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt boarded Challenger and left Torres Letro Valley. That means half a century of untouched ground. The boots they wore to leap and stumble in low gravity are still resting on the surface, left to keep lunar dust out of the cabin. They sit like empty shells, mute testimony to a moment when humans were bolder than they knew. The cameras are still loaded with film frames we decided not to bring home because every kilogram counted. Some were tossed out gently, their last photographs perhaps never developed. There is a strangeness to thinking that our memory of the moon is now mostly secondhand photos. Recordings and fading stories told by astronauts who are themselves growing older. The youngest men to walk there are now in their late 70s. The objects, meanwhile, have no age. They will look the same long after we are gone. Sunlight has bleached and baked them, but without moisture or air, they do not rot. If we never return, they may remain for millions of years. Artifacts of a small species that once looked up and dared to cross the void, and if someone or something else finds them far in the future, they will know we existed and that we reached at least this far. Some scientists worry about what will happen when we do go. Back footprints erased by rover wheels. Flags toppled by rocket plumes, our own early history accidentally disturbed. Others argue we should leave certain sites untouched, like a lunar heritage park. But no treaty fully protects them yet, and plans for new missions by NASA, private companies. And China will soon test how much we value that fragile record. For now, the moon keeps its quiet museum. Cameras with lenses clouded by dust, wrenches lying where they slipped from a glove, long poles with foil meant to catch the faint particles of the solar wind. These things cannot speak, yet they hold a piece of memory more durable than our voices. They tell us that a moment happened. Men walked here, worked here, dreamed here. And even if we forget details or lose tapes or misplace photographs, the evidence waits patiently under a sky that never changes. In that stillness, the line between past and present stretches far, and the question of what endures takes on a different weight. The moon remembers, even if we do not. And somewhere in the sea of tranquility, a camera still lies facing nothing, film unexposed to eyes, but not to time. A small human witness resting forever in the dust. If you hold an old sea chart in your hands, its edges yellowed and its compass roses faded to a tired pink. You may feel a quiet confidence that the world it describes was once real and fixed. Yet hidden inside its lines are entire lands that never existed. Coasts that were inked for reasons of hope, rumor, and sometimes deliberate deceit. Long before satellites drew sharp outlines of every shore, maps were built as much from hearsay as from hard proof. And the temptation to fill empty spaces was hard to resist. Sailors returned from voyages with half-remembered bearings. Merchants whispered about reefs and harbors that might shorten a crossing. And cartographers, anxious to be both accurate and original, often drew first and asked questions later. One of the most haunting of these places is Sandy Island. Long thought to sit in the Coral Sea between Australia and New Caledonia, it appeared on charts as far back as the 19th century, ported by whalers and merchant ships who swore they had seen breakers or dark masses of land. British Admiralty charts carried its faint outline. And later, so did modern atlases and even Google Maps, where it was a black sliver against the turquoise sea. Yet when the Australian research vessel RV Southern Surveyor sailed to its coordinates in November 2012, expecting to confirm or at least measure the shoals, they found nothing but deep, clear water. The ship's sonar showed depths of more than 1,000 meters, impossible for a sandbar to hide beneath. The crew laughed uneasily and recorded its non-existence. And soon the world's digital maps erased Sandy Island in a quiet, almost embarrassed update. All that remained were the ghost footprints of belief charts, data tables, and nautical logs that had trusted a rumor for a century. Another phantom lives closer to the Gulf of Mexico, Bermea, a small island supposedly lying off the Yucatan Peninsula. It appeared in 16th century Spanish maps and survived into Mexican documents as late as the 19th century. So convincingly that in the 1990s, when Mexico and the United States negotiated maritime boundaries and oil rights, the question of Bermea's position still mattered. If it existed, Mexico's economic zone might stretch farther north. If it didn't, Valuable waters belonged to no one. Survey vessels were sent to look, but radar and depth soundings revealed nothing but open sea. Conspiracy theories followed, whispers that the island had been deliberately destroyed, bombed or submerged, but geologists dismissed the idea, noting that islands can vanish naturally over centuries through subsidence and erosion. Still, the mystery of why a non-existent rock shaped real politics lingers as a lesson in how maps shape power even when wrong. Some false places were not accidents, but careful inventions. In the era before strict copyright, mapmakers feared plagiarism from rivals who could simply copy their laborious surveys and sell them cheaply. To guard against this, cartographers began adding small, fictitious details known as trap streets, a bend in a country lane that never existed, a cul-de-sac inserted into a quiet neighborhood. Even whole settlements, like the famously fabricated Agloe in New York State, were born this way. Agloe began as a paper trick. Otto G. Lindbergh and Ernest Alpers of the General Drafting Company coined the name by combining their initials and placed it at a crossroads in the Catskills. For decades it was nothing but ink. Then, strangely, a real shop called the Agloe General Store opened there. Taking its name from the map, and later maps began to show Agloe as if it were genuine. The hoax became truth for a time, a feedback loop between imagination and landscape, until the store closed and the spot faded again into obscurity. The fragility of place, once you start to look, is astonishing. Towns drawn to impress sponsors or mislead rivals ended up in atlases. Reefs dreamed up by sailors afraid of empty horizons shaped shipping lanes for generations. Whole kingdoms rose and fell on parchment before anyone set foot there. Even major mapping efforts, like the 1770s voyages of Captain James Cook, carried the weight of earlier mistakes. Cook deliberately struck phantom islands from charts as he failed to find them, yet new ones kept appearing from other sources. In the Arctic, imagined lands like Crocker Land survived in belief long enough to lure costly expeditions in the early 20th century, sending teams into lethal cold after a mirage reported by explorer Robert Peary. Modern mapping has more precision satellites, GPS, sonar, but it is not entirely immune. Digital services inherit old data, and once a shape enters the record, it can linger for years. Drivers following early GPS directions turned down roads that never existed or reached lakes mislabeled as highways. The illusion of authority that maps create can outlive their creators, which is why corrections like the erasure of Sandy Island cause such quiet fascination. They remind us the world on paper is a construct. To imagine those false lands now is to feel a kind of nostalgia, though they were never real. There is poetry in an empty sea that once promised a resting place or danger. In a ghost island that influenced treaties and dreams before being unmasked, each phantom tells a story not of geography, but of human longing for shortcuts, for safety, for ownership, for something solid to fill the unknown. Each trap street reveals a cartographer's small fight for credit and survival in a competitive trade. Each vanished reef speaks of sailors' fear and hope in waters too vast to chart completely. And so, though we fly satellites and print maps with crisp confidence, the idea that a place can exist because we believe it and vanish when we stop still hums quietly at the edge of every chart. Somewhere, perhaps another sandy island waits to be found false. Another Agloe is born in a database tonight, unnoticed. Our maps are better now, but they are still stories, and stories are living things. The next time you trace a coastline or a country boundary with your finger, remember how icily a name on paper can outlive the truth beneath it, and how sometimes the most vivid places are those we invented to keep the silence away. In the summer of 1897, when the Arctic was still more myth than mapped fact, and white space filled European atlases like a dare, a Swedish engineer named Salomon August André believed he could reach the North Pole not by ship or sled, but by air. His plan was audacious even then, to launch a hydrogen balloon, the Arnen, the Eagle, from Danskia, a wind-scoured island in the Svalbard archipelago, and let the prevailing polar winds carry him and his two companions over the unreachable crown of the world. André, with his thick mustache and careful notes, had convinced patrons and the Swedish Academy of Sciences that new lightweight, silk fabric and clever steering ropes would allow him to guide the craft enough to drift roughly where he wished. With him were Nils Strindberg, a young physicist and gifted photographer engaged to be married, and Knut Frinkel, a civil engineer and accomplished outdoorsman. They were men of calculation and optimism, convinced that daring and reason could turn an unforgiving wilderness into one more scientific triumph. On July 11, 1897, they stood on the wooden launch platform while the huge pale sphere strained against its ropes, shimmering with gas in the thin Arctic light. Crew and dignitaries waved hats and cheered as the Eagle rose into the gray sky, its three explorers shrinking to specks before vanishing into low cloud. Almost at once, trouble began. The balloon's new steering system, long ropes meant to drag and create directional drag, tangled and snapped, and hydrogen leaked faster than expected into the cold air. Within 10 hours, the men were forced to throw out ballast and adjust wildly to stay aloft. Ice began to cling to the silk, adding weight. By the third day, they knew the attempt had failed. They descended onto the pack ice, far short of their goal, still hundreds of miles from help, and began the grim work of survival. They dragged heavy sledges filled with cameras, scientific instruments, and food across shifting, grinding floes under a sun that never set but gave no warmth. Undri kept a diary, careful and spare, noting wind directions and temperatures, ration counts, and mechanical frustrations. Strindberg sketched and took photographs when he could, glass plates wrapped and protected, even as frostbite numbed his hands. They shot polar bears for meat, melted ice for water, and tried to reach Franz Joseph's Land or Spitsbergen, where rescue might be possible. But the ice itself betrayed them, breaking and reforming, drifting south when they needed north. Their boots soaked and froze. Exhaustion came faster than they could adapt. Still, they documented maps, photographs, letters sealed for loved ones at home. By October, the trio reached White Island, a barren spit of rock and ice in the Svalbard group, and pitched a final camp. Here, the Diaries grew short and halting. They built a crude hut of canvas and driftwood and tried to rest, but cold and sickness pressed in. Undri's last entry on October 17th was matter-of-fact about the worsening weather. After that, silence. For more than 3 decades, nothing more was known. Sweden mourned but moved on. The Eagle's flight became both cautionary tale and half-legend. Then in August 1930, the Norwegian sealing ship Brattvåg, working those remote waters, landed on White Island and stumbled on a shocking scene: a weathered boat half buried in snow, crates scattered and strangely intact, and human remains lying as if gently set down by time itself. They found Undri's diary, remarkably preserved, each page still legible, and film canisters carefully wrapped. They found boots with the laces tied, a stove, cooking gear, and bones arranged where the men must have fallen. Strindberg's fiancée back home, Anna Charlier, now middle-aged and long married to another man, learned that her lost beloved's notes and photographs had survived even though he had not. The recovered photographs, haunting grainy glimpses of sledges, hunting camps, and the 3 men among endless ice, brought the expedition back to life in a way words alone could not. There was a picture of the Eagle itself, half deflated and sagging on the frozen plain, and others of the men's faces, calm but weary. Developed decades after exposure, they became messages from a vanished world. Frozen light from 1897 carried intact across time. To read Undri's diary is to feel time collapse. July 14th, difficult day. Wind from southwest, progress poor. Then nothing until the finder's own notes in 1930. The gap is more than years. It is the difference between living struggle and cold archaeology. Yet in that gap, something powerful stirs, a sense of how fragile and determined human memory is. The expedition failed utterly. They did not reach the pole, did not return. But because the ice preserved their records, their attempt still breathes. People who were not yet born when the balloon rose could, decades later, hold the pages and glass plates and know these men as more than statistics. Today, the artifacts rest in Stockholm, in the National Museum, where visitors move quietly through cases of canvas and brass. The eagle's dream, impossible and reckless, sits alongside its wreckage, but also its beauty, the belief that the unknown could be met with planning and courage. Scientists have analyzed the notes for clues about what killed them, likely exhaustion, cold, perhaps trichinosis from undercooked polar bear meat, but the exact end remains uncertain. Part of the Arctic's final privacy. It is strange to think how the ice both betrayed and saved them. It trapped and killed them, yet it kept their story intact so that long after the balloon vanished into cloud and friends despaired, their voices could return. And there is something haunting but tender in that. The idea that time does not always erase. Sometimes it waits, patient, until the right hands arrive to pick up the thread. The Arctic, so vast and empty, still holds countless secrets under its crust of cold. Somewhere another sledge, another sealed note may be resting, waiting for the slow shift of weather and chance to bring it back to light. Endry's brief flight reminds us that even when memory seems lost, it can endure in places we never expect, written in frozen ink. Waiting for someone to listen. In the heart of the Catherine Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, just outside St. Petersburg, there once glowed a room so rich and improbable that visitors struggled to describe it without sounding feverish. Walls paneled with amber, honey, gold, deep russet, and pale lemon fitted together in elaborate mosaics and inlaid with mirrors and gilded carvings. The whole space flickering like a living flame when candlelight touched it. Known simply as the Amber Room, it had begun its life not in Russia, but in Prussia. Crafted in the early 18th century by German artisans Andreas Schluter and Gottfried Wolfram for King Frederick I, and later presented as a gift to Peter the Great. Over decades, Russian craftsmen expanded and refined it, until, by the reign of Empress Elizabeth and later Catherine the Great, the room had become a symbol of imperial splendor. Travelers in the 1800s wrote of entering a dream, a breathing air sweet with pine and polish, a feeling that time itself slowed in such golden warmth that dreams shattered during the Second World War. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, and German armies swept into Soviet territory, the great palaces outside Leningrad stood directly in their path. Soviet curators, aware of the Amber Room's fame and its fragility, tried desperately to protect it. They attempted to dismantle the panels, but the amber, dried and brittle after centuries, began to crack and crumble. With German forces closing fast, there was no time. They covered the amber with thin gauze and wallpaper in the hope it would pass unnoticed. It did not. By autumn, German troops occupied Tsarskoye Selo and recognized the treasure at once. Under the orders of Alfred Rode, director of the Kingsburg Castle Museum in East Prussia, the Amber Room was stripped piece by piece, packed into crates, and shipped west to Kingsburg, now Kaliningrad. There, it was reassembled inside the castle's museum for Nazi officials and visiting dignitaries to admire. A victory trophy gleaming even as war consumed Europe. From that moment, the story bends into fog. Kingsburg was bombed heavily by the Royal Air Force in August 1944 and later shelled by Soviet forces in early 1945. Witnesses recall flames engulfing parts of the castle. Rode himself claimed the room had been dismantled and stored safely before the worst destruction. But he died that year and left no clear record of where the crates went. Some reports insist the panels were hidden in a castle cellar and destroyed when the building burned. Others say they were loaded onto the German cargo ship Wilhelm Gustloff or another vessel and sunk in the Baltic as refugees. Fled the advancing Red Army. Soviet search teams, arriving after the war, found only fragments, a few mosaics, tools used in packing, nothing of the room itself. In the decades that followed, the Amber Room became not just an artwork but a ghost, inviting endless theories and secret hunts. Treasure seekers combed Prussian bunkers and mines, convinced it was buried deep behind collapsed tunnels. Some swore it lay beneath the ruins of Kingsburg Castle, sealed by Soviet authorities who wanted no reminders of Nazi plunder. Others traced rumors to Poland's Masurian lakes, to Thuringia's salt mines, to shipwrecks under the cold green Baltic where sonar has mapped dozens of wartime hulks. Occasionally an amber panel or carved cherub would surface on the black market. One appeared in West Germany in 1997, confirmed, authentic, and likely looted privately before the wars. But no full chamber followed. There is a quiet irony in how the room, designed to dazzle, now survives mostly as a whisper in an absence. Photographs taken in Kingsburg during the war show its panels glowing behind German officers' stiff smiles. Yet those images are now as haunting as they are proud. Survivors of the war in East Prussia spoke later of trains moving at night, guarded trucks heading to hidden depots, crates labeled innocuously. But record-keeping collapsed as Germany fell and as refugees scattered. Archives burned, officials died, and each retelling blurred further. Meanwhile, Russia decided to reclaim not the lost panels but the idea itself. In 1979, a team of artisans began the painstaking work of reconstructing the amber room from old photographs, surviving pieces, and centuries-old amber carving techniques nearly forgotten. It took 24 years. At last, in 2003, during St. Petersburg's 300th anniversary, restored amber room opened to the public in the Catherine Palace, shimmering again, but now as both replica and memorial. Visitors gasp, just as before, but always with an undertone of ghost story. The knowledge that somewhere, perhaps in a flooded Baltic hold or behind a sealed East Prussian wall, the original might still wait, its amber darkened but intact. History's most famous missing room, part of the fascination lies in how beauty behaves when it vanishes. Most stolen art resurfaces, eventually traced through collectors or seized in quiet police raids. The amber room is different. Its disappearance happened inside one of history's greatest upheavals, a time when entire cities disappeared and millions fled. Its records scattered like ash, leaving only rumors and the bitter certainty of loss. Each search expedition is less about profit than about memory, the urge to close a loop left open too long. And so the amber room lives now between fact and myth, its glow imagined more than seen, its weight measured in photographs and longing. Perhaps it was destroyed in 1945, its brittle panels consumed by the same firestorms that erased so much of Königsberg. Perhaps it lies in perfect silence somewhere dark, guarded only by cold and secrecy. Either way, the story it tells is larger than itself, that beauty, no matter how carefully framed and cherished, can be lost not just to time but to human chaos. And when the records scatter, the line between history and legend blurs. In that blur, the room still breathes, whispering across archives and wrecked charts, reminding us that remembering can be as fragile as amber itself, warm to the eye, breakable under the wrong pressure, yet capable of holding a fragment of the past forever if it can somehow survive. In the early years of the 20th century, long after the Spanish-American War had ended, and while most Americans at home were settling into a new century of factories, baseball and city skylines rising upward, the United States was quietly sending Marines and sailors into the warm harbors and tangled jungles of Central America and the Caribbean. These campaigns came to be called, not officially, but later by historians, the Banana Wars, a phrase that sounds almost playful, yet hides decades of occupation, firefights, and political reshaping that left deep marks on Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Honduras, and beyond. Between roughly 1898 and 1934, small but relentless military actions unfolded under the shadow of what Washington called the Monroe Doctrine and later the Roosevelt Corollary. The idea that the United States had the right to step in wherever European influence threatened or where instability might endanger American business interests. It was never declared as one long war, and that may be why it slipped so easily from the national mind. In Nicaragua, for instance, Marines landed in 1912 to protect a government friendly to U.S. shipping and banking, and then returned repeatedly, staying almost continuously until 1933. Towns like Bluefields and Corinto saw the sudden arrival of gunboats and khaki-clad troops. We patrolled muddy streets lined with banana warehouses and telegraph wires. There, a local man named Augusto Caesar Sandino would begin a guerrilla war. In the late 1920s, fighting occupation forces with a mix of hit-and-run tactics and fierce political vision. Sandino's ragged columns, carrying old rifles and machetes, managed to keep the world's most modern military tied down in remote mountain valleys. And though he was assassinated after the U.S. withdrawal, his name would echo decades later. In the Sandinista movement, a thread of resistance directly born from a war most Americans never realized was happening. Haiti's story is no less tangled. In 1915, after political turmoil and the lynching of President Vilbron Guillaume Sam, U.S. Marines occupied Port-au-Prince. They stayed 19 years. During that time, they rewrote Haiti's constitution to allow foreign land ownership, took control of the treasury, and built roads and bridges with Haitian labor, often forced at gunpoint through a system called the corvée. Rural Haitians, the Cacos, rose in revolt, waging a determined insurgency. Names like Charlemagne Peralty still hold reverence there. He was captured and killed by Marines in 1919, his body displayed publicly in an attempt to break the rebellion. A photograph of him tied to a door like a warning later, becoming a banner of resistance. Yet in the United States, these events merited only small newspaper paragraphs. Overshadowed by domestic politics and the slow march toward the Great Depression in the Dominican Republic. The Marines came in 1916 and would not fully leave until 1924, having taken over customs houses and installed a U.S. approved constabulary. In Honduras, U.S. troops landed 7 times between 1903 and 1925, usually to secure railroads or fruit company assets during coups and labor unrest. These interventions shaped borders and economies, but were rarely framed as war. They were police actions, stabilization, protection of American lives. At home, the public heard little except that peace was being kept for trade to flourish, because these campaigns were episodic. Parceled out in dispatches and short deployments, the memory of them never welded into one story. Soldiers returned. Quietly, there were no parades, no monuments on the National Mall, no yearly remembrances. Many Marines who fought in the hills of Nicaragua or patrolled Haitian roads lived to see their service tucked into small lines on discharge papers. The medals unspectacular, the history books sparse, yet in the places where the land was changed, memory persisted in other forms, in the whispered tales of grandfathers who saw gunboats in the harbor, songs about Cacos and campesinos, in street names and rebel slogans long after the flags were hauled down. Walking through Port-au-Prince today, one can still find the old Banque Nationale building, once guarded by Marines. Murals of Sandino in his wide-brimmed hat confront every visitor. In Santo Domingo, the old American-built barracks stand near government buildings as mute witnesses. These are quiet reminders of how streets and families were rearranged by wars unacknowledged beyond their borders. Land ownership patterns shifted to foreign companies. Labor systems and local politics bent to outside hands. Entire generations learned to navigate power that arrived from across the sea and left just as abruptly. It is tempting to believe history keeps track on its own, but the Banana Wars show how easily it can dissolve if no one insists on telling it. In the United States, the era was eclipsed by louder events. The First World War, the Roaring Twenties, the crash of 1929, the march to another global conflict. School books gave only a paragraph here and there about Caribbean interventions, if at all. By the time Franklin Roosevelt announced his Good Neighbor policy in the 1930s, promising less direct control in Latin America, most Americans felt as though a chapter had closed they never realized was open. Yet forgetting does not undo what happened. The Marines who built roads in Haiti and trained constabularies in the Dominican Republic shaped future armies and governments. The political wounds of U.S. occupations fed revolutions and distrust for decades. Even the phrase "banana republic," once describing economies bent to foreign fruit companies, like United Fruit, came from these years of intervention and still carries the sting of imposed order. When a nation misplaces a war, it is not gone. It lives on unevenly, vivid, where it was fought, and hazy where it was ordered. The maps of Central America and the Caribbean hold the imprint of those years, though the official pages of American history often skip over them. It is a sobering thought that power can be exercised, lives altered, cities occupied, and yet the country sending soldiers might remember nothing but shipping logs and blurred headlines. The people who endured it, however, keep their own ledgers, in songs, in family lore, in the names of movements that rise generations later, and so forgetting is never total. It is only uneven, leaving one shore silent and the other heavy with memory. Out on the open sea, long before radios or record players, the work of hauling lines and setting sails was stitched together by voices. Sailors sang to keep rhythm as they pulled heavy nets or raised canvas against the wind. Songs rose and fell. With the creak of rigging and the crash of waves against the hull, each chant carried not just melody but knowledge, verses about safe channels, shoals to avoid, weather signs to heed, and the secret names of distant harbors. In whaling fleets of the 19th century, men from New Bedford and Nantucket sang rough shanties that mixed English with snatches of Portuguese or Hawaiian learned in faraway ports. On Polynesian voyaging canoes, navigators chanted genealogies of stars and swells, maps in musical form that could not be written down but lived in breath and memory. These songs were living tools and companions, passed from mouth to mouth across generations and oceans. By the late 1800s, a new way of catching sound arrived. Fragile wax cylinders wrapped in thin tinfoil and turned by hand or by small clockwork mechanisms could capture a few minutes of music or speech. Anthropologists, missionaries, and collectors began carrying these devices aboard ships and into coastal villages, hoping to save voices they feared might vanish under the spread of colonial languages and new technologies. They recorded whale hunters chanting as they sharpened harpoons, women singing lullabies in languages no longer written, and the low called response of crews bracing sails under the night sky. But the sea is no careful archivist. One wreck could undo years of effort. In 1906, for example, a small schooner called the Daisy set out from Cape Verde with a cargo of whale oil and curiosities, including a collection of wax cylinders gathered by a young ethnography traveling among Atlantic islands and South American coasts. Somewhere off the Azores, a storm drove the Daisy onto hidden rock. The ship broke apart and sank in hours. Survivors took 2 boats, but the cargo went down. Among it were dozens of cylinders containing work songs, prayers, and love ballads from ports where English mingled with Criollo, where African rhythms had shaped seafaring life. None had been duplicated. In a single squall, entire soundscapes disappeared forever. Voices of men and women now only footnotes in shipping records. There are other losses just as sharp but less visible. Polynesian voyaging chants, long cycles naming stars and reefs, survived in oral chains for centuries, but contact, mission schools, and war fractured those chains. In 1946, an anthropologist named Kenneth Emery sailed through the Tuamatis with a recorder. But storms ruined many of his wax cylinders. Salt water seeped into cases, and the grooves collapsed into mush. The few songs saved are treasured today. But what he intended to preserve was far larger, now only described in his damp field notes. In whaling ports like Lahaina and Petta, sailors of the 1840s made up endless verses about their voyages. Wives left behind, and ships with proud names like Acushnet and Sunbeam. A handful were written down, but most lived only in air and are now untraceable. Leaving silent the rhythm that once guided heavy yards and hands blistered from rope, sound is a fragile sort of memory. Unlike stone or paper, it needs a body to hold it, or a device delicate enough to mimic one. Wax melts and cracks. The ocean loves to swallow anything so small and light. Even when records survive, technology moves on. A cylinder unreadable to later machines may as well be blank. The result is an ocean of lost music, not just songs, but languages and ways of knowing. For cultures where history is sung rather than written, each loss is more than entertainment. It is the vanishing of maps, recipes, ceremonies, and shared identity. There is a kind of grief in knowing this, but also a strange, stubborn hope. Sometimes a single cylinder surfaces decades after it was thought gone. In 2012, a collection from 1890s Hawaii was found misfiled at Berlin's Ethnological Museum, revealing chants no one alive remembered fully. In Norway, wax from Arctic expeditions survived long sea voyages by accident and now preserves. The voices of Sami hunters who would otherwise be unheard. These fragments prove that sound, once loosed into the world, can wait quietly for rescue. But for most, the silence holds. Somewhere under the cold green Atlantic are the last recordings of men rowing whales ashore while calling the sea by names older than charts. Somewhere on damp tropical beaches, songs once taught to guide double-hulled canoes across. Empty horizon are gone because no one sang them in time for the cylinder's fragile groove. The ocean is indifferent but thorough. It returns wood and ropes sometimes, even coins and glass. But it never gives back voices. Today, in small studios and village halls, people fight that silence with new tools. Digital recorders travel where wax once did, gathering endangered lullabies and work songs onto memory cards light enough to slip in a pocket. Polynesian navigators have revived their star chants. Hawaiian musicians study scratchy old discs and then teach them anew. But they work under a shadow, knowing how much has already vanished beyond recall. To listen to an old sea shanty, or a Polynesian voyaging song now, is to feel that shadow and the miracle that anything survived. The breath of unknown singers comes out of the past, thin and ghostly, but undeniable. It is a reminder that memory can ride a wave, but cannot fight a shipwreck. That whole worlds can vanish between one landfall and the next. And it is also a quiet plea to record, to share, to keep alive what still floats among us before the tide of forgetting takes it too. There are places where the desert seems to have built its own mirage of power and then quietly swallowed it, leaving behind flat concrete and silent towers that point at nothing. Drive long enough across Nevada's empty basins or the pale steppe of Kazakhstan, and you will find them, airports without planes. Hangars with their doors rusted shut, or domes pale as bone under a sky too wide for sound. These sites were once vital, busy, guarded. They were built at great cost in the years when the Cold War turned wastelands into stages for ambition and fear. Yet the moment passed, and human effort so loud and sure in the beginning fell away until only sun and dust remained. Outside Tonopah, Nevada, about 140 miles northwest of Las Vegas, an airfield stretches across Groom Lake's dry bed, and not far from it, another at Tonopah test range lies exposed to the wind. During the 1980s, Tonopah was alive with activity as stealth technology took shape in secrecy. The F-117 Nighthawk, that black wedge built to slip past radar, made its first flights from those long runways. Hundreds of engineers and airmen lived in temporary housing blocks, commuting by secret flights nicknamed Janet from McCarran Airport in Las Vegas. Radar domes watched the horizon. Hangars swallowed entire aircraft whole. But after the Nighthawk program went public and moved on, so did the people. Buildings emptied, windows shattered under heat and wind, and the guarded fences now keep no real secrets, only ghosts of schedules and test flights. Satellite images still show the runways perfect and pale against the brown earth. But on the ground, it is quiet enough to hear nothing but insects and the crunch of your own boots. Far away on the Kazakh steppe, the story unfolds even larger. The Baikonur Cosmodrome still launches rockets. But scattered across that immense plain are forgotten airfields and tracking stations once tied to the Soviet space and missile programs. The USSR's answer to NASA's program. Its runway is 4,500 meters long, wide enough for the shuttle to land, and once the pride of Soviet aerospace. Engineers tested giant transporters, and cosmonauts trained for landings under the pale glare of floodlights. But after the single unmanned Buran flight in November 1988 and the collapse of the Soviet Union soon after, the program died abruptly. But jackals roam where technicians once checked flight data. Control towers stand with windows knocked out, and the wind hums through steel doors flaking blue paint. The Semipalatinsk test site. also in Kazakhstan, tells a darker part of the same story. Here, from 1949 to 1989, the Soviet Union detonated more than 450 nuclear devices above and below ground, full of schools, theaters, and apartment blocks built in the clean, functional style of the time. When testing stopped and the USSR broke apart, those towns emptied almost overnight. Streets once patrolled by military trucks now fill with weeds. Laboratories are stripped bare. Doors stand open to the sky. Blackboards still carry chalk equations under layers of dust. Radiation lingers, visibly while silence covers everything else. There is a strange power in how quickly ambition can be abandoned when its moment ends. During the Cold War, these places thrummed with urgency. Budgets were bottomless, secrecy fierce. Engineers from Moscow or Washington worked under intense pressure to outpace the other side. Entire towns raised in seasons because to hesitate felt dangerous. And yet once the need evaporated, once treaties signed, programs canceled, or simply fashion shifted to new weapons, the infrastructure became excess weight. The desert and steppe took it back grain by grain, turning control rooms into echo chambers and barracks into windbreaks for tumbleweed. Walking such a site now is disorienting. The scale still impresses. It was meant to catch machines that no longer exist. You might find a control panel with Cyrillic labels curling away from rust, or a battered sign in English warning of restricted access, though no one comes to enforce it. At Tonopah, traces of night flights linger in graffiti and fuel stains. In Kazakhstan, faded murals of cosmonauts stare bravely from cracked plaster walls. The architecture keeps its posture long after its purpose has drained away. For the people who once worked there, memory is uneven. Some veterans return and are startled by how empty everything feels. Others prefer not to look back. Their work was classified and has remained emotionally sealed too. Local villagers in Kazakhstan sometimes scavenge metal or shelter livestock in abandoned hangars. But they also tell children not to stray too far because of radiation or unexploded ordnance. In Nevada, ghost towns of trailers and barracks stand within sight of modern drones buzzing elsewhere. New secrets rise, while old ones fade. These locked doors in the desert speak quietly about how human certainty ages. We believed these projects vital and permanent. We built with a conviction that they would anchor the future. Yet history moved on, faster than the concrete could crack. The runways now lead nowhere. The towers watch only sky and wind. And somewhere behind their sealed doors lie notebooks, flight logs, maybe forgotten film reels, pieces of lives lived at the edge of great endeavors. Left to dust because no one wrote their next chapter, it is tempting to imagine that ambition leaves a lasting mark. But here the opposite is true. The most secret, fevered work can vanish so completely that only satellite photos and local rumors remain, and there is an eerie beauty in that disappearance. 2. The way the desert erases, but also preserves, keeping shape while stripping meaning. A traveler who stumbles onto a silent airfield or a forgotten test range will feel it. The echo of engines that once roared. The weight of lives that once mattered intensely to someone. And the long patience of sand and wind reclaiming what humans thought they owned forever. In cities we like to think the ground beneath us is stable, that the pavement in basements and train tunnels rest on neutral soil. But in London, the earth is layered with centuries of lives. And every time someone digs deep enough, the past breathes again. That truth arrived in a blunt way during the building of the Crossrail project. A massive new railway line meant to speed modern commuters under the heart of the capital. When engineers and archaeologists began cutting through old neighborhoods and forgotten yards, they expected to find some Roman pottery or medieval walls. London has always offered up shards of its older selves, but what they uncovered at a worksite near Farringdon Station in 2013 stopped even seasoned diggers, long trenches of tightly packed human remains. Skeletons laid out head to toe, stacked in orderly but hurried rows. They had stumbled into a plague pit, one of the Black Death burial grounds from the mid-1300s, that had vanished from maps, but not from the earth. At first, the site had been a soccer field for postal workers. Flat patch of grass tucked behind buildings, ordinary and unremarkable. Kids had chased footballs across the very spot where, in 1348 and 1349, Londoners terrified of contagion had brought their dead by the cartload. Historical records spoke of such emergency cemeteries. Brother John Clynn's chronicle mentions pits without number dug as the great pestilence killed half the city. Yet over the centuries streets shifted, parishes merged, and memories blurred. No one alive knew precisely where all those hurried burials lay. The field's quiet surface hid thousands of stories. Archaeologists working for the Museum of London began methodically to expose the rows. They found not only adult bones, but children's tiny ribs, teeth worn by medieval bread, and traces of the bacteria Yersinia pestis, still detectable in molars with modern testing. Some skeletons bore marks of lives ended not just by plague but by hard work, spine damage from carrying loads, healed fractures from falls. Among them were remnants of simple shrouds, a few coffin nails, and the odd belt buckle or pewter cross. These were ordinary Londoners, buried fast in terror, but even so, care had been taken to lay them straight, to orient them east-west as Christian practice dictated, showing that even in catastrophe, some dignity was preserved. For the Crossrail team, discovery was not just a delay, but a sobering confrontation with how cities build over their own dead. The soccer field gave way to centuries of forgotten burials. Beneath those plague victims were even older, Roman roads and coins. London's surface had shifted countless times since, adding layers of cobblestones, cellars, Victorian pipes, and electric cables. Each generation walked and worked unaware of what slept a few meters below. This was not the only such unsealing. Other parts of the Crossrail dig turned up 17th-century plague pits near Liverpool Street and an entire lost cemetery of Bethlehem Hospital, once called Bedlam, where the mentally ill had been interred quietly. Some of those remains told stories of malnutrition, ancient surgery, and disease outbreaks long before germ theory. The archaeology teams treated each discovery with a kind of reverence in science, bones catalogued and studied, DNA sequenced to trace how plague evolved, then reburied respectfully once research was done. Yet there is something unsettling about the whole process. Commuters now speed each day through tunnels drilled beside these pits, unaware that their morning train runs past what was once an apocalyptic burial ground. Office towers and cafes stand over graves no longer marked, and football once played casually above the resting place of thousands who died when death carts rattled along Farringdon's lanes. It is not disrespect so much as forgetting by default. Cities expand and smooth their ground until tragedy becomes topsoil. London is not alone. Paris has its catacombs, but also thousands of hidden graves sealed under metro lines. New York's Washington Square was once a potter's field, but in London, perhaps because of its age and density, the effect is especially strong. One world layered over another until a dig for new transport shakes loose a memory no one expected to meet. The Crossrail project was modern, efficient, forward-looking, yet its most talked about. Legacy may be the skeletons it disturbed. Standing at the excavation in those years, reporters wrote of a smell of damp clay and ancient wood, of white bones glowing under floodlights while high-rise windows looked down. Archaeologists spoke quietly about the people they were meeting. How many had died so fast that names and stories were lost before any could be written? Some bones showed signs of later disturbance, as if later construction had already clipped the edges of the pit. The city had been cutting through its own dead unknowingly for centuries. Once analysis finished, the remains were gathered and moved with ceremony to a modern cemetery. They were no longer anonymous plague victims. Each had contributed genetic data and physical evidence that rewrote parts of medical history, proving, for example, how the plague bacterium adapted and how Londoners' immune systems responded. Even in death they spoke, though no one asked them to, for anyone living above such ground. The story invites a quiet shift in perspective. The places we call ordinary soccer pitches, loading docks, quiet parks can be deep with unmarked experience. We inherit cities layered with both triumph and catastrophe, and we move over them mostly unaware. But sometimes a subway dig or a foundation trench peels back the cover, and the truth waits patiently. Lives were lived here, ended here, forgotten here. When machines pause and workers kneel among bones centuries old, time folds in on itself. The present sees the past face to face, and for a brief moment, the city remembers what it once chose not to mark. Long before the world shrank into instant messages and satellites, people who found themselves separated by oceans or trapped beyond help sometimes turned to the oldest and most uncertain messenger imaginable, a scrap of paper sealed in glass and surrendered to the sea. The act was at once desperate and hopeful, a belief that currents invisible and unknowable might carry words farther than any ship. Each bottle cast adrift held a small human wager against forgetting, though most vanished quietly, swallowed by storms or buried in sand. And the few that did arrive often landed long after the sender's life had ended. One of the oldest known stories begins in 1784, when Chinosku Matsuyama, a Japanese seaman shipwrecked with 43 others on a Pacific atoll, carved his final account into thin strips of coconut wood and sealed them in a bottle. The crew had been blown off course and stranded without fresh water. Matsuyama wrote of thirst, of attempts to dig wells in coral, and of each man's death. He cast the bottle into the current. More than a century later, in 1935, the bottle washed ashore in Hirado, the very village where Matsuyama had been born. His descendants read his farewell long after he and his shipmates had turned to bone and reef, the sea finally completing a journey he could not. The pattern repeats across time with haunting variety. In 1914, Private Thomas Hughes, a young British soldier, bound for the trenches of the First World War, wrote a short letter to his wife Elizabeth on the eve of his deployment. "If it should be that I am taken," he began gently, "remember, I loved you." He tucked the letter into a green ginger beer bottle and dropped it into the English Channel as his troopship left port. Hughes was killed in action 2 days later near the Marne. The bottle, however, traveled slowly with tide and current for 85 years until it was found in 1999 by a fisherman, Steve Gowan, in the Thames estuary. Hughes's daughter Emily, by then in her late 80s and living in New Zealand, finally held her father's words, a message from a man she could barely remember because she had been only 2 when he died. She said it felt as though the sea had kept him safe until it was time to return him. Not every letter was born of tragedy. Some were science disguised as poetry. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, oceanographers deliberately set thousands of drift bottles to study currents, each with instructions to return the find's location. One such bottle, released by the Glasgow School of Navigation in 1914, was recovered in 2012 on a beach in Shetland to 98 years later, earning a world record for longevity. Its original scientific purpose was long moot, but the survival of a message across a century felt deeply human, as if the ocean had decided to honor a small experiment. Yet for every note that surfaces, countless more lie hidden or destroyed. Bottles are fragile. Glass cracks under ice, shatters against rock, sinks under barnacles and seaweed. Ink fades, cork dries and leaks. And so many goodbyes, declarations, even jokes hurled from ocean liners or warships have no witness. They were written with trembling or with calm, sealed with wax or twine, and offered up to chance and chance, mostly swallows without answer. The romance of the bottle endures because of that uncertainty. Each find is a tiny resurrection. A fisherman hauling net spots glass caught among the mesh. A child combing a tide pool sees paper through green water. A beach walker bends to pick up what looks like trash and discovers someone's life folded within. The moment is electric. Time collapses. A name and date appear, sometimes written in spidery script, sometimes printed carefully with pencil that survived against all odds. Often the details are plain. A sailor listing the ship's name and position, a couple announcing a honeymoon voyage, a scientist asking for help charting drift. But in reading, the finder becomes part of the story, bridging decades with a glance. Occasionally, the aftermath is quiet but moving. Some messages are answered when possible. Others cannot be. In 1956, a Swedish sailor's bottle carrying greetings to an unknown finder washed up in Finland 40 years later. The author was long dead, but his family learned strangers were still reading his words. In Maine, children once found a bottle from a World War II Coast Guardsman and wrote to his widow, who had never remarried and wept to know her husband's note had traveled all that time. There is also an unmeasurable cultural pull in the image of the bottle itself, so small against the sea, yet persistent. It appears in literature, in songs, in film, because it is a physical metaphor for memory, vulnerable, wandering, occasionally rescued. We understand instinctively that a letter adrift is a voice refusing silence. In the modern age, practice hasn't vanished completely. People still toss bottles with coordinates and emails instead of postal addresses, though some worry about pollution and choose biodegradable materials or digital equivalents. Oceanographers now use buoys with GPS and sensors, but a few romantic scientists still slip a paper note inside as tradition. The old impulse survives, to speak into the void and trust that someday someone might listen, standing on any lonely shore with a bottle in hand. You feel the improbable chain it might enter, currents bending across continents, storms and calms, the thin chance of landfall and discovery. You know it will likely fail, but failure is part of the beauty. And if one does survive, if a bottle lands in sand decades later and someone kneels to open it, a stranger's voice can reach across death and time. It is the ocean's slow post. Careless, and yet sometimes astonishingly faithful. Each message found is a reminder that forgetting is powerful, but not absolute. Words can drift far beyond their senders and find life again in unexpected hands. Even when love letters never reach the beloved or warnings sink before saving anyone. The act of sending matters, it marks a refusal to vanish quietly. The sea may not return every song or story, but it returns enough to prove that what we release into the world can outlast us. Sometimes long enough to touch another heart when it is most ready to listen. In April of 1815, on the island of Sumbawa in what is now Indonesia, the volcano Tambora tore itself open with a violence so great that sailors, hundreds of miles away, thought they were hearing cannon fire. Villages close to the mountain vanished instantly, smothered under superheated ash and surging clouds of gas. Entire kingdoms known for rice and horses and carved wooden palaces were erased before news could carry. Yet the shockwave of Tambora did not stop at its shores. Over the weeks that followed, an invisible veil of ash and sulfur climbed into the stratosphere, spreading east and west until it circled the entire planet. A thin gray shroud too high to see, but thick enough to scatter sunlight for years. The world changed almost without understanding it had changed. By the time the great cloud reached Europe and North America, no one connected it to a mountain few had heard of. Newspapers in London and Boston reported strange weather by the summer of 1816, but no certain cause. In the absence of explanation, preachers warned of divine anger. Farmers muttered about witchcraft, and scientists blamed sunspots or comets. In truth, Tambora's eruption had released more than 150 cubic kilometers of ash and gas, the most powerful volcanic event in recorded history, and its fine sulfuric particles turned the sky into a subtle mirror, bouncing sunlight back into space and dropping global temperatures by an average of 3 degrees. It was enough to bend the calendar itself. The year 1816 became known to those who lived through it as the year without a summer. New England, June brought killing frosts. In Quebec, snow fell in July. The Hudson River froze again in August. Crops failed across the northern hemisphere. In Ireland, oat harvests blackened and rotted. In Switzerland, grain prices tripled, and desperate families boiled nettles and moss to survive. New England farmers slaughtered livestock they could no longer feed and packed up wagons to head west, hoping for kinder soil in Ohio and beyond. In China, the cold ruined rice paddies along the Yangtze and sparked famine and disease. In Bengal, cholera outbreaks followed hunger. The disruption was so broad and strange that whole communities forgot what normal seasons felt like. And yet, while the suffering was sharp, the cause remained mysterious. Telegraphs did not exist. Scientific networks were slow. Reports of Tambora's eruption were carried in colonial dispatches that took months to reach Europe. And by the time they did, the immediate connection between a faraway island's disaster and northern skies, gone dim, felt improbable. People saw instead what was near: red sunsets that blazed in eerie, almost apocalyptic color. Paintings from the period by artists like J.M.W. Turner show those blood-tinged horizons. Summer snow that lingered on hills, harvest moons behind veils of haze. Diaries mention birds going silent at midday as storms blew in and sudden frosts cutting down whole fields of corn. Farmers noted rings around the sun, strange halos they did not know were caused by ice crystals high in a cooled atmosphere. From that disquiet came unexpected cultural ripples. In the summer of 1816, a group of young writers gathered at the Villa Diodati near Lake Geneva, trapped indoors by relentless cold rain and dark skies. Among them were Mary Godwin, later Mary Shelley, and Lord Byron, their eerie. Firelit evenings gave birth to Frankenstein and Byron's poem Darkness, works infused with the sense of a world out of joint and a sun that could disappear. Across Europe, artists painted strange, fiery twilights, unaware they were recording the physics of volcanic aerosols. Yet, just as quickly as the weather shifted, the cause slipped away from ordinary minds. By the 1820s, when seasons steadied, the famine years blurred into local memory. People remembered hunger and migration, but not the reason. Tambora itself remained remote, an Indonesian name on obscure colonial charts. Only later, when scientists pieced together layers of ice cores in global accounts, did the scale become clear. The connection was like a buried fuse. A mountain erupting in April 1815, killing tens of thousands. Nearby, but quietly shaping lives as far as New England farms and Swiss lakesides the next year. Standing today on Sumbawa slopes, where villages like Tambora and Pecat once thrived. You can still see blackened caldera walls and lava fields. But the silence belies how far that moment reached. Locals keep oral traditions of a loud mountain that destroyed whole towns. Outside Indonesia, few know its name. Weather historians now use volcanic winter to describe what happened, and scientists measure its sulfur signature in Greenland ice. But those are technical terms that do not match the human experience. Wedding dates moved because crops failed. Letters describing cold summer nights where firewood ran out. Churches filled with prayers for mercy. Under strange skies, the way Tambora erased a calendar and yet disappeared from collective awareness, says something unsettling about memory. Catastrophes can be global and still dissolve if their edges are slow and their stories scattered. Without a clear villain or banner headline, famine becomes bad harvest, migration becomes restless spirit, and paintings of blood-red sunsets become aesthetic instead of testimony. Even when the link is later proved, the feeling of living through it is gone. And yet, quietly, Tambora lives on in what it set in motion. Families that moved west from frozen Vermont helped settle the American Midwest. Romantic and Gothic literature took on new darkness after that dim Swiss summer. Studies of the eruption's climate effects shaped modern volcanology and meteorology. But the event itself remains half forgotten, a ghost at the edge of history's stage. To consider Tambora now is to remember how thin the veil of normal can be, and how quickly invisible forces, a hidden eruption, a drifting veil of ash, can rewrite lives before anyone understands what is happening. It is also to feel how icily such rewriting slips from the record once skies clear. A single mountain changed the light of day for millions. Inspired stories still told 2 centuries later, and yet most calendars, most school lessons, pass the year without a note. The summer that never was lingers only if we insist on seeing. What the earth tried to tell us when one quiet April turned the whole world briefly cold, and strange tie in places where the air is thin enough to sting lungs and the horizon stretches past imagination. Climbers sometimes disappear so completely that even their names begin to slip from conversation. Yet the small machines they carried, cameras wrapped in frost and cloth, wait under drifts of ice and snow. On Mount Everest and Denali and other high peaks, long after ropes have snapped and tents have shredded, film has been found, brittle and curled, but still able to speak. It is one of the strangest ways a person's last hours can outlive them, not through journals or witnesses, but through images caught. Just before the cold closed in, Everest especially has given back such messages. In 1933, British pilot Douglas Hamilton spotted something unusual on the mountain's upper slopes while flying an early reconnaissance. But no one reached the site. It would be decades before the most famous of the early mysteries, George Mallory and Andrew Sandy Irvine's 1924 summit attempt, drew modern searchers. When Mallory's body was finally found in 1999 at 26,760 feet, frozen and bleached but still wearing remnants of his tweed climbing clothes, he carried no camera. But the hope of one persisted. Irvine was known to have an early Kodak vest pocket with him, and if the pair had reached the summit before dying on the descent, the film might have captured it. Searchers have scoured for that camera for years because even in an age of GPS and satellite proof, the idea of a single roll of images resting silently under ice is magnetic. To this day, it has not been found. It may yet surface, its fragile nitrate film possibly still holding an answer, no words recorded. But others have returned. In 2013, an Indian expedition found an AGFR camera belonging to a climber lost in the 1970s on Nanda Devi. It's not Everest, but another Himalayan giant. The pictures, painstakingly developed by conservators in cold labs, showed smiling faces at base camp, then weather closing in, then final shots of tents sagging under fresh snow. An unfinished story frozen for 40 years. In Alaska, Denali has its own secret archives. In 1989, a team recovered a camera from a crevasse that had belonged to Ray Jeanette, Swiss-born American guide who died on the mountain in 1979 after summiting with clients. His film, though partly fogged by cold and time, still held moments from high camp, a partner's face outlined by frost. The curve of Cornist Ridge under a late sun. Jeanette himself had been buried by storm just after those frames were shot. There is a powerful tension in these images. They are ordinary snapshots, rope lines, stoves, faces half hidden by goggles, but they become sacred because they are final. To handle one is to touch hours no one survived to describe. Families often weep quietly when they see them, not because the pictures are gruesome, but because they are alive with unguarded detail, a grin, gesture, the mountain huge and close behind. It is life stopped mid-sentence. Film's physicality adds to the weight. Digital cards can corrupt or vanish. Paper notes can soak and rot. But photographic negatives, if cold and sealed from light, can endure for astonishing spans. When rescuers or later climbers stumble across a decades-old camera half buried in scree or ice, the first instinct is care. They keep it cold, wrap it, sometimes fly it frozen back to labs where specialists coax images out without further damage. The chemical ghosts of silver halide grains can hold their pattern long after a body is gone. Beyond personal grief, there is an eerie immortality. Climbing lore is built from these fragments. Magazine spreads and memorials often feature photos that survived while names faded. Even anonymous reels have circulated, a set of shots found on Mont Blanc showing 1950s climbers. None identified, but now digitized and viewed by thousands. Their faces, strangers to us, still smile across time because their cameras lasted when everything else failed. Sometimes the mountain itself seems complicit in keeping the record. Cold preserves. Dry air slows decay. Items lost at lower altitudes might rot in a year. But at 8,000 meters, a glove can lie unchanged for decades. The same ice that kills can cradle. Yet there's cruelty too. The images return without the people, and often the tiny hope of explaining what went wrong is dashed. A camera might show clear skies and happiness, then nothing, offering no clue about the fatal turn. But even that absence matters. It gives families a last known day. For climbers who go now, there's a quiet ritual in thinking about what they carry. Many still bring cameras, GoPros, and digital Nikons, but they know that if the mountain claims them, it's only something that can survive cold and time might speak. Guides talk of wrapping memory cards in multiple layers, of sealing notes in waterproof bags alongside gear, not for themselves but for whoever might come across them decades later. Looking at one of these recovered images, you feel how small and stubborn memory can be. A strip of film less than an inch wide holds sky and breath and laughter from a place where everything else turned to silence. It is not a grand monument, but it pushes back against forgetting just enough to let someone know that these climbers were there, that they saw and felt and tried in an age that records almost everything. There is something humbling about the idea that a single roll of film could outlast maps and headlines, quietly waiting in snow until the right hand's lifted. The pictures do not shout. They whisper across decades. They remind us that even when names fade from conversation and graves are impossible on ice, a glance, a ridgeline, a smile and blowing spindrift can survive. And somewhere high above the clouds, perhaps under another layer of storm, there may still be cameras sealed and sleeping, holding light from final hours no one remembers, but that the mountain, in its own indifferent way, has kept safe for someone else to find. The sky has always promised freedom, yet it keeps secrets with a patience that unnerves even those who know its winds and routes best. When an airplane vanishes, the loss feels absolute. There is no road to follow, no trail to search except the restless blue and the cold water beneath it. Families wait, radios crackle, newspapers fill with speculation, and then, when weeks pass and nothing is found, time smooths the panic into a dull acceptance. But sometimes, decades later, the sky gives back pieces of what it once swallowed. And those pieces arrive without enough explanation to heal the open wound. The result is not closure, so much as a strange echo, proof that something happened, paired with the enduring blank of why. One of the most haunting examples is the British South. American Airways flight known as Stardust. On August 2nd, 1947, the Avro Lancastrian left Buenos Aires, bound for Santiago with 11 souls aboard, including war veterans, business travelers, and a single child. It sent ordinary radio updates as it crossed the Andes, then, near the end of its journey, tapped out a final word in Morse code, Stendic, repeated 3 times. No one understood it then or now. Some guessed an encrypted weather report, others a hurried sign-off mangled by poor signal. After that, silence. Chilean and Argentine teams scoured the mountains, but found nothing but clouds and stone. For 50 years, Stardust became legend. Folded into aviation mystery lists, alongside Amelia Earhart and Bermuda Triangle tales. Then, in 1998, climbers on Mount Tupungato saw strange metal glinting through glacier ice. As summer melt grew stronger, wreckage appeared, landing gear, engines, shreds of fuselage. Investigators climbed to nearly 15,000 feet and found human remains still in heavy 1940s clothing. Papers sealed in ice and surprisingly legible. The glacier had hidden the crash site all along, slowly carrying the debris downhill until climate change and time revealed it. But while the find answered the simple question of location, it left the riddle untouched. Why the plane descended to low remains? Unclear. Weather reports suggest a storm and strong headwinds fooled the crew's dead reckoning, but no definitive proof emerged. Stendic still taunts anyone who reads the recovered telegrams. For families, the discovery offered bones to bury, but not the story to fit around them. The Stardust is not alone. The American military's Flight 19, training squadron of 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers that vanished off Florida on December 5, 1945, remains one of aviation's most famous losses. The pilots, confused by compass failure and worsening weather, radioed increasingly anxious messages. We are not sure where we are. Everything looks strange. Then static. Search planes went out. One of them, a PBM Mariner, also disappeared, probably in an explosion, taking 13 more men. Despite decades of searching, no confirmed wreckage of Flight 19 has been found, though bits of Avengers have surfaced elsewhere. Museums hold small parts, but the exact fate of those crews is still uncertain. The story became part of the Bermuda Triangle mythos, but at its core is something quieter. Young airmen, lost to storms and confusion, remembered mostly by lists of names on fading plaques. Civilian mysteries linger as well. In Alaska, the disappearance of House Majority Leader Hale Boggs's plane in 1972 sparked one of the largest search efforts in U.S. history, hundreds of aircraft scouring mountain and tundra, but no trace of the Cessna 310 was ever found. In 1956, two airliners collided over the Grand Canyon, and while that disaster was located and documented, pieces of the wreckage still wash down remote ravines, surprising hikers decades later. Each new fragment reminds us how slowly the land returns what falls from the air. There is a particular sorrow in these stories because flight was supposed to master distance, to conquer isolation. Yet when something goes wrong, the very vastness it promised works against us. Clouds close. Radar loses track. Oceans absorb without trace. Paper trails of manifests and weather logs outlive the bodies they describe. Families grow old and die waiting for news that never arrives. And then, perhaps half a century on, a glacier sighs, an ice field retreats, or a hiker strays off path and steps into history. Debris emerges that proves existence but not fate. The forgetting is gradual and practical. Airports rename gates. Airlines merge and repaint. Governments box up investigation files. Newspapers shift to other headlines. Only in the crash communities, the small circles of relatives, pilots, and historians, does the ache stay sharp. Meanwhile, the sky above remains indifferent and unmarked, busy with new flights. Modern jets with satellite tracking have reduced some of this mystery, but not all. The loss of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 and 2014 shows how easy it still is for an aircraft to slip away beyond radar and into ocean trenches too deep for easy search. When we do recover a long-lost plane, the feeling is not simple relief. Standing among the twisted aluminum of stardust or any similar find, investigators often describe silence more than excitement. There is the realization that these objects have been quietly moving with glaciers or tides while empires rose and fell, while children grew into grandparents. The lives inside were interrupted mid-conversation, mid-journey. Yet something as fragile as film or a leather briefcase can persist long after memory failed. Perhaps that is why these discoveries compel us so deeply. They prove that absence is not the same as erasure. They hint that somewhere under ice, underwater, beyond charts, the past is still waiting, though its answers may come too late to comfort. And they show how forgetting works in open sky, not deliberate, but diffuse. A steady thinning of attention once the search planes return empty. A nation can misplace a war, as earlier chapters have shown, but it can also misplace its lost travelers, till chance cracks the sky's silence for just a moment and lets one message through. Then we are reminded that the air, for all its vastness, is not empty. It keeps what we send into it. And sometimes, when the timing is strange and the world has moved on, it gives back enough to make us remember again. Across the empty whiteness of Antarctica, where the horizon can disappear in blowing snow, and the cold feels more like pressure than air. Men once wrote by candlelight in small tents or crude wooden huts, the paper trembling beneath hands that could hardly hold a pen. They wrote because it gave shape to fear and because it was the one thing still under control when storms pinned them down and ice crushed the timbers of their ships. Long after those hands stiffened and the bodies failed to return, their journals remained, tucked into boxes and tins, sealed against damp and time as if they understood they would have to make the journey home alone. Few stories show this better than the great age of Antarctic exploration, when the desire to map and claim the southern continent pushed ships into a world that did not forgive mistakes. Sir Ernest Shackleton's ill-fated Imperial Transantarctic expedition of 1914 to 1917 produced one of the most famous survival sagas. And while Shackleton and most of his men lived, what they left behind reveals how words can endure even when the mission they describe collapses. When their ship Endurance was locked and finally destroyed by the Weddell Sea's pack ice in October 1915, the men camped on drifting floes for months before making the desperate boat journey to Elephant Island in South Georgia. Frank Hurley, the expedition photographer, kept a diary alongside his glass plates, recording temperatures, rations, and quiet despair. Shackleton himself wrote, keeping formal entries even as their world shrank to a tent and a few sledges. Those journals, brought back in battered boxes, survived the cold and the sea voyage, and still sit today in archives, their pages brown but legible. They outlasted the ship, and some of the men who wrote them died years later, still haunted by the ice. Yet the words hold steady, letting readers step hour by hour through the ordeal. Even more haunting are the diaries of Robert, Falcon Scott's Terra Nova expedition. Scott and his team reached the South Pole on January 17, 1912, only to find Roald Amundson's Norwegian flag already planted weeks earlier. Exhausted and demoralized, they turned back into worsening weather. One by one, men collapsed on the return, frostbite creeping up their legs, food and fuel dwindling. Scott wrote to the very end inside a tent pinned down by blizzard a few miles short of a supply depot. His final entries, dated March 29, 1912, addressed his wife, his infant son Peter, his friends, and the British public.
We are weak.
Writing is difficult, he noted, with fingers so cold they could barely move. But for my own sake, I do not regret this journey. When a search party found the tent 8 months later, the men frozen side by side. The journals were there too, ink faint, but still clear. They came back to England and became both testament and tragedy, read aloud in Parliament, printed in newspapers, and later bound in volumes that let strangers hear the voices of men who had ceased to exist before their words traveled. There are smaller, quieter examples scattered through polar history. In 1959, a Soviet expedition to the pole of inaccessibility left notes about their isolation and the eerie silence that pressed in at the continent's coldest heart. Ilzo's records were found decades later by another team crossing what had become an abandoned station. The Belgian Antarctic expedition of 1897 to 1899, under Adrien de Gerlache, endured an unplanned winter trapped in pack ice aboard the Belgica. Crew diaries, especially that of physician Frederick Cook, survived to describe the first human experience of Antarctic night and near madness under endless darkness. Cook's careful observations of scurvy and psychological strain became invaluable too later. Explorers long after some of his companions died or drifted into obscurity. There is a particular intimacy in these writings because they were not composed for us. They were often written for a small imagined circle, a wife waiting at home, a future expedition leader, sometimes only for the writer's own sanity. Shackleton once said that recording gave him a sense of command over chaos. Scott clearly wrote, as a farewell and as a defense of decisions he feared would be questioned, and yet those private lines, meant to steady a single person in an unthinkable moment, are now the spine of how we know those stories at all. The material world tried to erase them, moisture from melting ice, winds strong enough to rip tents to shreds, months of darkness at -40 degrees. Ink can freeze and burst. Pages can shatter like brittle leaves. To protect them, men packed journals into tins or oilskin and stowed them deep in sledges. In Scott's case, his companions spent precious energy hauling scientific specimens alongside the diaries because both felt sacred. In Shackleton's camp, Hurley chose which photographs to save and which to smash on the ice when weight became critical, keeping only what he believed might speak if he could not. When those words finally returned, they shaped more than history books. They taught later generations about endurance, leadership, and the delicate psychology of survival. They also gave families something no telegram of missing, presumed dead ever could: a voice. Kathleen Scott, reading her husband's last farewell, could at least hold the physical proof of his love and intention. Generations later, visitors to London's Polar Museum lean over the same handwriting and feel for a moment the immediacy of cold breath on paper. There is something quietly defiant in a sentence that crosses such a gulf of time and death. The writer's body may lie beneath ice that no one will disturb, yet the mark of pen and thought moves on, outliving ship timbers, governments, and sometimes the very reasons the expedition set out. In a world where even digital files seem fragile, these century-old, wind-battered pages are a reminder of the stubbornness of human need to be heard too. Imagine a frozen tent lit by a single sputtering lamp and a man dragging his pencil across. Stiff paper is to see how survival can take forms beyond breath and heartbeat. Some did not make it home, but their words did, crossing an impossible distance on behalf of their lost owners. And so the Antarctic remains not only a graveyard of explorers, but also a library quiet. Vast, waiting where ink endures and memory, though wounded, refuses to vanish. In every country, there are skeletons of bridges that were meant to join two sides but never touched. Structures that begin with fanfare and steel, but end in silence, left to rust in air, or sink slowly into weeds and tide. They stand as monuments, not to connection, but to interruption, half-spans rising from riverbanks, ramps to nowhere, pillars marching bravely into water, and then stopping, as if the dream simply broke midstream. The reasons vary. Funding evaporates, politics shift, wars intervene, economies collapse. Yet the result is strangely similar everywhere. Concrete becoming a kind of fossil. A record of ambition paused mid-motion. One of the most haunting examples lies in Italy, deep in the Calabria hills, where the Viadoto Italia was supposed to anchor a grand highway network that never quite finished its route. Construction began in the 1960s, with post-war optimism. Italy's autostrade were going to link the rural south to the industrial north. Massive piers were poured, tunnels carved into limestone, steel girders floated high above valleys where goats grazed. But costs ballooned, and political crises came and went. Some sections opened, but others stopped abruptly at ridges with no road beyond. Decades later, you can drive a finished highway and glance out to see ghost ramps slicing into forest, blocked by chain link and brush, promising a road that was never laid. In Spain, similar relics stand from the pre-2008 boom years, when infrastructure spending soared under easy credit. Outside Toledo and Ciudad Rio, tire viaducts were built for a high-speed rail line that lost financing and passengers before it opened. Smooth concrete rises, graceful and perfect, but there is no train and no station at either end. Wind whistles through drainage holes, birds nest in expansion joints. Locals call them puentes, a ninguna part, bridges to nowhere, and use them as landmarks for lost opportunity. The same story reaches across oceans. In the United States, in the Deep South and Midwest, there are aborted sections of interstate highways. It's built when federal funds were flowing in the 1960s and 70s, but abandoned when routes changed or protests stopped urban demolitions. In St. Louis, an enormous double-decker ramp rises out of trees, curving elegantly before ending in mid-air above the Mississippi floodplain, the remnants of the once-planned but canceled South County connector. In New York, the bridge to nowhere in the Bronx was supposed to link the Sheridan Expressway to the Bruckner. The concrete arches still stand decades later, graffiti climbing where cars never drove. Perhaps the most dramatic modern case is the unfinished Nicaragua interoceanic canal bridges. It's begun when a Chinese firm promised a rival to Panama's famous passage. The project, announced in 2013, envisioned highways and viaducts slicing across forests and wetlands. But after protests and economic upheaval, work stalled. A few isolated spans and approach roads remain, half swallowed by jungle and doubt. Testimony to a geopolitical gamble that faded as quickly as it arrived. There is something eerie but beautiful about these structures, engineers designed for decades of traffic and weight. But when those vehicles never come, the lines and curves become sculpture. Piers jut from rivers like standing stones. Rebar curls into the air like vines. The weather does its slow work, rust blooming on bolts, ivy pulling at cracks, but concrete ages gracefully compared to the ideas that shaped it. Children bike on empty decks. Teenagers climb for views. Photographers turn the silence into art, yet the human cost is harder to romanticize. These bridges often displaced neighborhoods, flooded farmland, or tore into hillsides with dynamite before being left unfinished. In Calabria, some farmers lost olive groves for access roads that now end in weeds. In St. Louis's, entire blocks were cleared for approaches that led nowhere, leaving scarred lots and broken communities. A paused dream can be as disruptive as a completed one. Why such forgetting is easy has to do with time and shame. Governments change, budgets tighten, and no one wants to own the failure, so projects simply fade from speech. Locals adapt, telling jokes about the bridge to nowhere. But behind humor is disappointment, jobs promised, commerce imagined, a sense of future withdrawn without ceremony. Over decades, vegetation softens the edges. A new generation grows up never knowing what the girders were for. Occasionally, the pause breaks and something living returns. In parts of Spain, abandoned viaducts have become cycling paths and wildlife crossings. In the US, some empty ramps are repurposed as public parks or scenic overlooks. Italy has slowly finished portions of its southern highway network, folding forgotten piers into new designs. But often the cost of reviving old skeletons is too high. Easier to build new than untangle permits and corrosion. Standing on one of these decks, looking down at still water or forest that was meant to be crossed, you feel the weight of halted intention. Every bolt and span represents planning meetings, loans, labor, political speeches, entire seasons of belief that movement forward was inevitable. And yet it wasn't. History is full of such half gestures. Bridges just make them visible. There's a quiet lesson here about memory and ambition. We tend to think only finished things will last, but sometimes it's the abandoned that endures most vividly. These spans, frozen mid-leap, resist erasure because their incompleteness catches the eye. Travelers photograph them. Locals give directions by them. They slip into collective folklore more than many successful but ordinary roads. They prove that hope leaves marks even when it fails. In time, the desert and forest and tide will reclaim them fully, moss across concrete. Rivers undercutting pilings, sand burying ramps. But for now, they wait, poised between utility and ruin, silent monuments to human plans that outpaced patience or money. They remind us that progress is not a straight road and that forgetting can be built as easily as remembering. Somewhere a bridge stops halfway across a valley and no one drives it. But it still stands in the mind like a question about what we try to connect and what we leave undone far north. Where the sea freezes hard and the sun can vanish for months, there is a steel door set into the flank of a mountain on the Norwegian island of Spitsbergen. Snow piles deep against its concrete wedge, and the air stings with salt and wind. Yet behind that simple entrance lies one of the quietest and most ambitious acts of remembrance ever attempted. The global seed vault at Svalbard is not grand in the way of cathedrals or monuments. It is a tunnel cut 120 meters into sandstone and permafrost. But inside are shelves upon shelves of life, waiting in patient dark. More than 1 million seed samples from nearly every country on Earth rest there. Sealed in foil packets and sturdy boxes, wheat from Kansas beside rice from the Mekong Delta, teff from Ethiopia next to potatoes from the Andes. Each packet is a small promise that even if disaster strips a region bare, its crops can be born again. The vault was opened in 2008 after decades of quiet planning. Scientists and agriculturalists knew how easily diversity can vanish. Wars and climate change had already erased countless local varieties of food plants. Syria's conflict destroyed parts of the world's oldest seed bank in Aleppo. But because duplicates had been sent to Svalbard, chickpea and barley strains once feared loss could be returned. The idea is simple but profound, a backup memory for agriculture. Cold enough and deep enough to survive centuries without power. Built so far north that even if political lines shift and cities fall, seeds might still sleep untouched. The vault's designers chose Svalbard partly because its permafrost is so deep that if refrigeration failed, the interior would stay below freezing for decades. The entrance is high enough to resist sea level rise and, they hope, the chaos of warming. But to build such a place is also to admit a certain fear. The forgetting is not a rare accident, but an expected part of human life. Nations gathered their agricultural heritage and sent it away, not because they trust their own continuity, but because they know how easily wars, economic collapse, or neglect can erase fields and knowledge. The vault is both a bet against that forgetting and a confession of its certainty. Svalbard is not alone under the ice. Deep in Siberia and across the Russian Arctic, the Soviet Union left other archives in permafrost. Though their intention was secrecy rather than salvation, during the Cold War, whole research stations and record caches were buried or abandoned as budgets shrank and borders shifted. On Novaya Zemlya, where the USSR tested its largest nuclear weapons, tunnels were sealed with documents and samples still inside, measurements of fallout, maps of Arctic currents, even reels of film shot during the Tsar Bomba test of 1961. Some of these remain locked and frozen, unvisited since the Soviet collapse. Scientists today sometimes uncover caches of data in half-collapsed bunkers, logbooks of aurora studies, climate notes from drifting ice stations, names of men whose service was classified so thoroughly that families never knew where they'd been. The irony is sharp. One polar archive is meant to outlive disaster and help rebuild. Another hides behind forgotten politics, holding knowledge once guarded to the point of disappearance. Yet both depend on the same cold earth to keep them. Permafrost is an accidental librarian, suspending decay while humans argue and move on. Sometimes it keeps things we want. Sometimes things we feared and left behind. There's a quiet human hopefulness in believing ice can serve as vault and witness. The Svalbard designers carved their tunnel above the airport at Longyearbyen, a mining town turned Arctic outpost, and lined it with concrete thick enough to shrug off shifting ground. They installed heavy steel doors but left them unlocked. Any future needing food should not be barred by our politics. On the door glows a faint blue light in winter darkness, almost ceremonial, signaling to no one in particular that something valuable waits inside. Inside, boxes are stacked neatly and labeled by country and species. Barley from Morocco sits beside maize from Mexico, each with its scientific Latin name and collection date. It is oddly moving to think of generations of farmers distilled into packets and barcodes. The old Soviet caches are less orderly, yet their existence tells a similar story. Some were built for polar research, meteorology, ice drift, ocean salinity, vital data points taken when few dared venture so far north. When programs ended abruptly in the 1990s, stations were evacuated and papers left behind in locked metal cases. Now, as permafrost thaws and explorers retrace routes, there are reports of weather logs from 1957, still crisp and legible. Notes in Russian about wind speed and auroral brightness lying under layers of frost. In a warming world, those records may help scientists understand climate change, though the men who wrote them had no such aim. Both kinds of archives rely on an uneasy alliance with time. We hope that future people, whoever they are, will know how to read what we left. That our languages and labels will not have drifted too far. A seed vault is useless if no one remembers how to germinate a grain. A logbook is silent if no one can translate its script. Yet there is no way to be sure. Those who stored their life's work in the ice did so anyway, trusting that the act of saving has its own worth even. Without a guaranteed reader, to stand at Svalbard's steel door, or to imagine a rusted Soviet safe under endless white is to feel the smallness of individual memory in the long game of survival. Human beings build and lose, remember and forget. But we also tuck things away with a stubborn sense that somewhere, someday, someone will need them. In that way, the frozen North is both archive and confession booth. We admit our fragility and our forgetfulness while trying to cheat them just a little. And so, under layers of ice, lie to impulses. Braided together, hope that knowledge can outlive us, and proof that it rarely does without help. Whether it is a tiny black barley seed from Aleppo waiting in the Svalbard dark, or a weather log left by a forgotten Soviet scientist at -40 degrees, the cold holds them still beyond politics, beyond collapse. They are messages to whoever comes next, saying quietly that we were here, we tried to remember, and we trusted the Earth's oldest lock ice to keep the door closed until another hand, far in the future, dares to open it. Somewhere, a small town sits empty, paint peeling from its storefronts and ivy climbing the edges of windows. Where children once leaned out to shout at passing trucks, wind moves trash across the cracked main street, and a single calendar, yellowed and curled, still hangs on the wall of a shuttered barber shop. Its date long obsolete. There is no sign that the lives lived here were less real than ours. Only the slow retreat of notice, the quiet certainty that no one comes back to look. What happened in these streets, births and weddings, fights and reconciliations, harvest fairs. The whispered warnings of approaching storms has not been destroyed by force or flame. It has vanished more softly, because the last people to tell the stories left or died, and no one else came to listen. Memory's end is almost never sudden. We imagine forgetting as a clean break, but most of the time it unravels thread by thread. A diary stays unopened on a shelf after its author's funeral, waiting for someone curious enough to read the looping ink inside. Letters sit in an attic box until the roof leaks and the paper warps. The words once urgent now blurred beyond saving. A photograph bends in half under damp cardboard, and the smiling faces are gone without ceremony. What began as a personal record, the scratch of pen, the careful date in a corner, was once a safeguard against being lost. Yet if no one touches it, the protection thins until it is nothing at all. Across this book of quiet recoveries and disappearances, there have been cities drowned and later exposed, voices drifting at sea in bottles, diaries dragged home from ice after the men who wrote them lay frozen yards away, seeds banked against the end of farming, bridges halted in midair, like punctuation left at the edge of a thought. Each story is a reminder that memory is not an automatic current. It needs carriers, readers, diggers, wanderers, sometimes pure accident, to keep it alive. Without them, even the largest eruption or most daring voyage can slip out of reach and become a puzzle piece without a picture. There is a certain humility in realizing how fragile our witness really is. We have filled the world with cameras and satellites and cloud backups, but every technology is only a promise until someone chooses to look and to care. The reels found on frozen mountains held their pictures because of cold and luck, but they spoke because a person took time to develop them, to peer at the grain and recognize a face. The seed vaults buried in Arctic rock will last centuries, but only if future hands bother to open the door, read the labels. Coax life back out of dry shells. Even footprints, the simplest record, prove temporary. On Antarctic ice, they vanish with the first wind. In desert dunes, a whole caravan's passing can disappear overnight. On beaches, we leave messages with our feet and tide claims them before day's end. The earth is not cruel, only practical. It keeps what it must and clears space for what comes next. We are the ones who imagine permanence where there is none, and yet within that fragility, there is a kind of survival, because forgetting is never complete. Small fragments resist. A child finds a rusted nameplate under weeds and asks whose it was. A researcher opens a tin of paper from a long-closed station and feels the presence of another mind. A climber stumbles upon film and sees strangers smiling into a sun that killed them hours later. Each fragment is enough to stitch a little thread of connection, enough to prove that an event really happened and that someone once stood there breathing and trying to matter, perhaps. That is why we keep telling stories, building archives, digging up ruins, setting down words even when we know they may sink beneath time. We are not trying to defeat forgetting, no one can, but to slow it, to light small signals for whoever follows. A record is a wager that someday another pair of eyes will pause, that the life behind it will flicker back for a moment. The task of witness is quiet work. It is cleaning out a grandparent's house and choosing not to throw away the box of letters, even if they are yellow and the ink faded. It is reading a field report from 1912 and hearing the cold inside its clipped sentences. It is standing at the edge of a half-built bridge and imagining the men who poured its first concrete in the belief it would change the future. It is noticing that the world is layered with traces and deciding that some deserve to be named again. Looking back across all the places where memory faltered, drowned streets, silent runways, secret vaults, paper sealed in ice, one lesson emerges. Survival is not only breath and food, but also remembrance. A culture lives as long as someone can summon its voice. A family lives as long as someone speaks its names. When those voices go quiet and those names go unsaid, an ending arrives more final than physical death. But there is comfort too. Even the faintest trace can call something back. A bottle lifted from tide, a diary page spared by weather, few seeds held against the dark can restart a conversation centuries later. So long as someone opens, reads, plants, listens, the thread holds. It may thin and fray, but it does not have to break. We walk forward on layers of other lives we seldom think about. Beneath every modern street and screen and rail, there are stories waiting like pressed flowers, some fragile enough to vanish with the next shift of soil, some patient enough to wait for a finder. To live with awareness of that is not to drown in nostalgia, but to keep faith with the quiet human instinct to remember. It asks only small acts to read, to look, to save what might otherwise slip away. Forgetting will keep happening. The world is too wide in time, too relentless for any other outcome. But witness, fragile as it is, still stands against the tide. One empty town reclaimed by weeds, one unread journal, one fading trail in sand does not mean everything is lost. It means the work is unfinished and always will be. It is ours to continue for as long as we can reach back and hold even a single story in our hands.